A very good morning to one and all present. It is my great pleasure and honor to welcome you all to this webinar on Australian literature organized by the PG and Research Department of English of Ethiraj College. Today's speaker, Dr. Sourav Banerjee, is known for his research, presentations, and other works in Australian literature. He is an associate professor of English in Mahitosh Nandy College, affiliated to the University of Calcutta. In his 18 years of teaching experience and 6 years of research experience, he has published more than 10 articles in reputed, refereed national and international journals. He has made 14 research articles presentation in various national and international conferences.
Subject expert, Dr. Banerjee. Thank you, Dr. Banerjee. Over to Dr. Banerjee. Thank you.
Now, may I request Ms. Vanilla to introduce the theme of the seminar, please? Vanilla.
Good morning. The seminar today is about the post-colonialism of literature of Australia. Now, post-colonialism, if we see, it deals with the literature produced by the people who were once colonized by the European imperial powers, dealing with themes such as racism and colonialism. And it also relates to the themes such as political and cultural independence of the former subjugated people. Now, Australian literature, if you see, it comprises the literature of both the white settlers and the Aboriginal people of Australia. The writing of the descendants of the white settlers is an amalgamation of their foreign culture and the awareness of their culture as a.
Thank you. First, I'd like to confirm if I'm audible, if all of you can hear me clearly. That in order to study Australian literature, or for that matter, any literature, we cannot study only the key texts. We must more importantly study the contexts. Now, this is very much in keeping with the part of the post-colonial literary history. Vivek Chakraborty says that there is no literature is pure in the sense that it is completely free of historical influences. The socio-political and economic conditions of an age has a bearing on the literature that is produced in that period. So today what I've planned to do is that I'll first talk about Australia, its formation, what is, and then talk about the development of Australian literature, its poetry, its prose. I will not be talking about drama because that is not my area. And then I'll talk about the themes of Australian literature and, of course, post-colonialism. And I will try, I don't know how much I'll be able to do it, but I'll try to link it to a couple of texts in your syllabus. So to begin with, Australia, or officially the Commonwealth of Australia, is a country that lies in the Southern Hemisphere. And as far as the history of the inhabitation in the Australian continent is known, the land was inhabited by the indigenous Australians for about 50,000 years before the first European settlement in the continent happened in the latter half of the 18th century. The language these people spoke was classifiable into roughly 250 groups. But there is not enough recorded history of all these, and therefore the records of this period are popularly termed as the prehistory of Australia. Whatever we know as the history of Australia is in Australia was spotted and colonized by the Europeans. It therefore is no mean task to understand what Australia really is or what it actually means. Now, Richard White, in his introduction to the book called Inventing Australia, has commented that, and I will quote, "There was no moment when, for the first time, Australia was seen as it really was. There was no real Australia waiting to be discovered," unquote. So you see, Australia was not a given entity served on a platter. Australia was made Australia. Now, contrary to public opinion, it was not the Europeans who had first discovered Australia. Centuries before had the Indians, the Chinese, the Greek, and the Arabs who had some idea about this island, but their ideas were based more on imagination rather than on experience or, shall we say, information. And it was only in the 16th and the 17th centuries that the Western Europeans decided to seek out this land called Terra Australis Incognita. Nobody knew that. But the Portuguese, the Spaniards, and the Dutch saw very little in this island that was profitable. In fact, the image of this island provided by two Englishmen, namely William Dampier and Captain James Cook, at the end of the 17th and the 18th centuries, respectively, proved the more powerful ones, and they lasted longer. Of the English, shall we say, over the others was not because the English were more, what should I say, qualified or something like that, but it is just an accident that they discovered the more fertile side of the island and the social revolution taking place in England at that time. Yet, the pictures they painted about Australia were not at all enthusiastic. In fact, Dampier was very unimpressed by the natives and he called the Aborigines, quote unquote, the miserablest people in the world. And even as late as the 1840s, it was commonly thought by the white people, someone important like Augustus, that the Aborigines were the last link in the great chain of existence which united men with the monkeys. So just look at this logic. The logic was that since Australia was furthest from civilization, read Europe, England, it must necessarily show the least evolved. This was the logic. But on the other hand, to the people with an interest in natural sciences, the curious flora and fauna of Australia was indeed an element of and required observation. Australia, it was considered to be a land of oddities. It was called the antipodes, where everything was reversed, played a huge role in the formulation of the theory, organic theory of evolution at the cost of the chain of beings. You remember the Elizabethan chain of beings, another thing that continued actually till Australia was discovered, and Australia had a huge role to play in inverting that. And Darwin's The Origin of Species in 1859 was very much influenced by the findings in Australia. Initially, the picture contributed to what was called to be Australian, or who were called to be Australians, but they were referred to as Australians, and it was not the white population who were called the Australians. The white population was still the British. To bear Magwitch, when he finds out that Magwitch, in fact, is his benefactor and transforms him into a gentleman. Such was the stigma associated with being an Australian. Was never removed to New South Wales in 1840, and the rest of Australia in Eastern Australia rather in 1852, and Western Australia in 1886. The common sentiment was that once a convict, always a convict. This convict still, and 1850s, Australia slowly shed its convict image from the 1850s to the hungry 40s. It was also believed that many people even committed crimes in England so that they huge profits and a way of erasing poverty in England. But Australia to try that is this rural utopia. Australia was always seen as a kind of, though they were thought to be, yet they were also seen as politically in advance of Europe by virtue of being more democratic and radical, thus attracting a lot of interest. But for a country to become a country, you needed some myths, you needed some legends, you needed some heroes, you needed some national fitness. So national fitness now was measured by that time, of course, and war was regarded as the ultimate test of manhood, and Australia, nature and urban bohemian values. The bushworkers were even idealized by authors and artists in an attempt to create nationalistic symbols, certain generations. They tried to make them realize that everything Australian was good. And I'll come back to it when I'll talk about the cultural cringe and the flip side of the coin. and that they should take pride in their country. Parents and teachers were asked to make children feel proud about Australia and all things Australian. Distinctively, Australian themes and motives started becoming popular in art, architecture, decor, and literature. The boomerang and the kangaroo became brand images. But uh, approval of the white Australian policy. The all-round became the focus of Australia. In fact, there were interstate. Naturally, they were against any kinds of celebrations of this sort, as it was nothing but an invasion of their land. And as Australia tried to become self-sufficient, interest. There was an interest in Aboriginal culture in the late 19th century, and later Catherine Eliza Somerville Stowe, better known as K. Langloh Parker, and David Unaipon in the island began with reports sent back to England after the settlement. And as we can understand, all what it owned a place of making one's livelihood. So it is not just a place where you come and make your livelihood and stay there. It has to have a culture, it has to have a history, it has to have a myth. John Tranter uh, is next in the next phase. We get books like the New Australian Poetry in 1979. John Tranter was its editor, and it marks several shifts. It marks a shift from the British culture to American culture, the influence in Australian literature, from a literary voice, convicts, and the earlier phase of Australian novel was writing about convict life by convicts or ex-convicts. So in 1831, the first Australian novel to be written and published in Australia was Quintus Servinton, a tale founded upon real. And these proved that the lives of Australians could be used to write tragic novels. These series, it dealt with the story of an Irish doctor called Richard Mahoney, as the title goes. So he is ill-treated in England simply because he is Irish. So he leaves England to go to Australia. He's not very good as a doctor, but he makes some money by supplying equipment to the goldfields. With that money, he comes back to England, but now he's treated as a colonial element. And so he is ill-treated once again. And he returns to Australia, not only as a place where is going to make money, but as his home. So this kind of a tradition of making Australia your home, not a second-grade England, but your home where you belong, comes up. Then we also have the development of what can be called socialist realism. And it developed during the depressions of the 20s and the 30s. And there were a number of left-leaning writers writing on social issues. So we have novelists like Catherine S. Pritchard speaking out on behalf of the working class people in her novels like Working Bullocks in 1926. Dimf Nakusak writing about the industrialization of the Australian society and the condition of the workers in factories, and how the health system in Australia is important to have health coverage or hospitals, not only for the very rich people, but also for the common people in Australia. And we also have Dorothy Hewitt writing her Bobbing Up in 1959 about women working in spinning factories in Polish who come to Australia, yet they cannot shrug off these responsibilities. This comes into novels like Kate Grenville's Secret River, where she looks into colonizing history and the possibilities of original people early on, and how it went bad pretty quickly for all sorts of reasons, primarily because of mutual incomprehension among them, as he is not accepted by society. See people, and they were pitted against these very strong and almost disregardful colonial Australian soldiers. So during these encounters, it dawned upon the Australian soldiers that though they belonged to the British, and were essentially very different, and they were really Australians. And this feeling became even more stronger during the Second World War, when the British troops gave up on Singapore in order to fight their own war in Europe, and wanted the Australian troops to be sent to Europe when the Australian troops were being invaded by Japan. And the Australian Prime Minister had to say to Churchill that no, we cannot send our troops to defend your country in Europe. We need our troops to defend our country. We need our troops to defend our people in Australia. So that is our priority. Now, this created a radical movement against Britain politically. And as also at points when the Australian troops found themselves with the American troops in places like Durban and Brisbane and other places, they got exposed to a whole new culture that they hadn't seen previously. And from that time on, Hollywood started uh, to feed into Australia, and Australians started to imagine themselves much more in American terms rather than British terms. And the final nail in the coffin, so as to say, was when Britain joined the European Common Market, leaving its trading partners in the colonies to fend for themselves. Also, after the Second World War, the Australian government brought in people from Italy, Greece, Holland, Germany, Poland, etc. And so colonialism. So on the one hand, we have small populations, British controlling large populations.
Ask your questions now. It is time for discussion. If you have questions,
Ma'am, there's just one more thing that I'd like to say before anything else. That I find that my data connection is going off. So if it goes off, I'll be someone's what should I say, ethics and values. You feel that entire group of people. You feel that entire group of people. Australia has this thing called nationalism. There are two kinds of nationalisms in Australia, as in India, but I'll not talk about India because it will become too political. So,
okay, since there is network failure here also,
oh, okay,
out of time, I think.
Okay, so ma'am, see, I have talked.
Let me. Sir, okay, who have joined.